The Assisted Highlight and the Single Button Assistant are two new features that are designed to help players learn and understand their class's rotation. This video is going to break down what these two features do, how they work, and most importantly, how you can use them. First, let's talk about what these features do, as they both operate the same at their core. Each class has an ideal rotation that they should follow. Typically, players would have to navigate to a third-party website like WoWHit or Icy Veins, plug in their talent choices, and then read up on what their ability priority is. With these new features, Blizzard is trying to reduce the reliance on these outside resources. The Assisted Highlight and Single Button Assistant will examine your class, examine your spec, and then relay what abilities you should be using and when you should be using them, all in real time. This rotation also takes into consideration debuffs that your class must track, as well as procs and how many enemies are grouped up. So as an example, an Unholy DK relies on keeping a debuff called Festering Wounds on its current target, and you apply Festering Wounds with an ability called Festering Strike. The rotation assistance will ensure that either before the Festering Wounds falls off, or as soon as it does, it immediately puts Festering Strike as the next ability to use. The assistant also examines how many enemies are grouped up and if it is more beneficial to use an AoE ability. It will automatically switch over to prioritizing those abilities from a single target. So now that we know the core of these features, let's talk about what they don't do. It won't use or suggest major offensive cooldowns, nor will it use any defensive cooldowns. If a mob is casting an interruptible spell, it will not suggest an interrupt ability. It won't suggest any crowd control abilities, potions, nor trinkets. You are still required to use those abilities on your own. Now let's differentiate between the two features, starting with the Assisted Highlight. Open your game menu, go to Options, and under the Advanced Options, there is a checkbox to enable it. Once turned on and you engage an enemy, it is going to highlight each ability that you should use. So as you can see, the button gets highlighted on your action bar, and then once pressed, it then highlights the next button on your action bar, and this continues until you disengage from the enemy. The Single Button Assistant, on the other hand, is added to your action bar from your spellbook. So open your spellbook, look in the top right corner, click and drag that button onto your action bar to whatever hotkey you want to assign it. Just a note here that if you hover your cursor over the button in your spellbook, it will display all of the abilities that are going to be used. These are also the abilities that is used when you're using the Assisted Highlight. Once on your action bar, this button will now automatically cycle through your abilities every time you press the appropriate hotkey. Your first thought on hearing that might be, well, why would I use the Assisted Highlight when I can just hotkey one button and do the exact same thing? That's a great question, and I'll expand on this more in just a bit. But the main reason is that using the Single Button Assistant results in a large DPS loss due to a global cooldown penalty. So, what is the main benefit of using these tools, and which should you primarily use? WoW's leveling is fairly quick, and you can quickly be overwhelmed with the amount of abilities that are being unlocked. These tools make this a little less challenging and will give you a good grasp of your class's core rotation. I highly recommend that you use the Assisted Highlight over the Single Button Assistant, as it also helps you develop your muscle memory of pressing multiple hotkeys. Can all roles utilize this? The short answer here is yes. DPS and tanks can utilize these tools to efficiently learn and play their class. Healers can also use these tools, but keep in mind it only suggests damaging abilities. It's not going to suggest your flash heals, rejuvenations, chain heals, and etc. Tanks need to be aware that it doesn't use defensive cooldowns, so you have to actively be aware when utilizing mitigation. So a quick recap before we dive into the Single Button Assistant, because that needs its own discussion. The Assisted Highlight should be the tool you primarily use for three main reasons. First, it visually highlights your class's core rotation. Second, it helps you develop the necessary muscle memory for pressing a bunch of different keybinds. And third, there is no penalty associated while using it. Now let's dive into the Single Button Assistant. In my opinion, this is primarily an accessibility feature, however, it does have its uses. The main reason I believe this is due to the global cooldown penalty that's associated with using the tool. Your global cooldown is the time you must wait before you can use your next ability. This is why even if you use an instant cast spell or a melee ability, you still have a brief period where you can't press another button. The Single Button Assistant has a 25% global cooldown penalty once it's pressed. Is this 25% penalty noticeable? Absolutely. If you've been playing WoW and are comfortable with your class, you will notice and feel that 25% penalty when you are going through your rotation. So, how about a noticeable damage difference? The answer again is yes, and I'll give you a simple example with some hypothetical numbers. Global cooldowns are different for every class, and they also change depending on your stats. But let's use a standard 1 second global cooldown, meaning you have to wait 1 second before you can use your next ability. With a 25% penalty, you're now waiting 1.3 seconds before each ability. Let's say you have a 5-minute boss fight, and there are 2 players casting the same spell that hits for 1000 damage. Player 1 has a 1 second global cooldown, and player 2 has a 1.3 second global cooldown due to the 25% penalty. 5 minutes equals 300 seconds. Player 1 gets off 300 attacks and deals 300,000 damage. Player 2 gets off 231 attacks and deals 231,000 damage. I also rounded that number up. That's a pretty substantial difference. Healers, some of you may be thinking, and I say this because I was curious myself, can we use this single button assistant to throw in some easy damage while we are also healing? Basically, freeing up some of our keybinds. The short answer to that is yes, but, and a big but, just know that once you press the single button assistant keybind, the global cooldown penalty triggers for everything. Meaning that even if you press this button twice and now need to get off a heal, your healing spell is delayed due to the global cooldown penalty. So using the 1 second, 1.3 second example, heals are going off every second. I press the single button assistant twice. I'm now waiting 1.3 seconds before I can cast my next heal. Personal opinion, I'm just not going to use it. Now, in general, this isn't to say that you can't use this tool. I just want to temper expectations and inform you. This just isn't viable for pushing content, so it's better delegated as an accessibility use or for story and lower difficulty in-game content. More specifically, like low-level delves, heroic, maybe Mythic 0 dungeons, LFR, and possibly normal raids, but that's about it. With that said, I'll give you a personal example of when I'm going to use the single button assistant. I have a Resto Shaman that I push content with. However, I have not learned either of the DPS specs, and I don't have any desire to learn them. So when I'm going to clear world quests or do some story content, I'm going to switch over to the elemental spec, plug a generic talent tree in, and then throw the single button assistant as my number 1 hotkey so that I can easily breeze through and enjoy the content that I'm doing. So there you go. That's pretty much everything you need to know about this tool. DPS, tanks, healers, everyone can use it in different capacities, and I personally think it's a great new feature to help people learn a new class or even understand their own class better, especially without having to constantly have a rotation guide up on your second monitor. I'm curious of your thoughts and tell me if or how you are going to be using it. Shout out to these channel members. If the video helped, then give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you enjoy WoW content. I have plenty of guides, tips and tricks, podcasts, and more. You can show extra support by becoming a channel member. It's 99 cents a month and gives you early ad-free access to all my videos. Check out the Prefessional merch and my downloadable cheat sheets. I'll see you in the next one.